I was 22 when I walked into my townhouse and heard my own footsteps echo back at me. The couch was gone. The dining table we bought on clearance our first week in Savannah was gone. Even the framed wedding photo that used to hang crooked above the hallway light switch had disappeared, leaving behind a faint rectangle on the wall like a ghost of something that had once mattered. For a moment, I honestly thought we'd been robbed. Then my phone buzzed. Joint account access restricted. I stared at the notification, reading it twice. Then 3 times. My chest tightened. I opened my banking app. 0 balance available. No explanation. That was when I noticed the envelope taped neatly to the inside of the front door. Foreclosure notice. Final warning. And then I saw him. Travis was sitting at the kitchen counter on one of the 2 remaining stools. His car keys laid out in front of him. His suit jacket folded with care. He wasn't angry. He wasn't panicked. He looked relieved. "You're home," he said evenly. "What happened?" My voice didn't sound like mine. He leaned back slightly. "Almost casual. You were never meant for the kind of life I'm building." The words didn't land all at once. They hovered between us, sharp and clean. He said them the way someone might explain a business decision. We had been married 18 months. I had left my marketing program at a state college in Georgia so he could move us to Savannah for his startup. He said it was temporary. He said once investors came in, we'd both benefit. I handled the apartment, the errands, the small things that made chaos look organized. He handled the money. He insisted on it. "It's more efficient if I consolidate everything." He'd told me early on. One decision maker. Less confusion. I thought that was what partnership looked like. I thought marriage meant security. "What do you mean?" I asked, gripping the back of the empty dining space where the table used to be. "Where is our furniture? Why is the account frozen?" "It's not frozen," he corrected calmly. "It's closed." My stomach dropped. I transferred the remaining funds this morning. The company needs restructuring. Investors require clarity. It's cleaner this way. Cleaner? I stared at him, waiting for the part where he said this was temporary, or strategic, or complicated but fixable. Instead, he slid a folder across the counter. "Divorce papers are filed," he said. "You'll be served formally next week." I didn't sit down. I couldn't. My knees felt unreliable. "You're divorcing me." The word tasted foreign. "This isn't personal," he replied. And that was the moment I understood that it absolutely was. He began explaining things as if I were a junior employee. He had transferred company ownership solely into his name weeks earlier. He had amended the operating agreement. Investors wanted streamlined control. It had to look decisive. "But I'm still on the loan," I whispered. He didn't answer immediately. The silence was louder than anything he could have said. I had to protect the business. He finally replied, "The debt is joint. That's just how it works. You signed the papers." I remembered signing documents late at night, exhausted, trusting him when he said, "It's standard. Just routine filings." I never imagined my signature could be sharpened into a blade. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. He glanced down at his watch. A new one I'd never seen before. Polished. Expensive. 3 months, he said, after the second round of investor talks. 3 months. That meant while we were still sleeping in the same bed. While I was cooking dinner. While I was defending him to my mother when she asked why I looked tired all the time. "You told people I was bad with money," I said slowly, remembering a comment from his sister weeks earlier. He gave a small shrug. "You don't understand leverage. You're emotional about it." Emotional. That word landed harder than the foreclosure notice. "So that's it?" I asked. "You empty the account, move the assets, file for divorce, and leave me with the debt." "It's not about leaving you," he said, standing now, gathering his jacket. "It's about moving forward." "Forward without me?" He walked past me toward the door, pausing just long enough to add, "You were never built for real life." "Naomi, I am..." The door shut softly behind him. I stood alone in a townhouse stripped to its bones. The air felt hollow. I called the bank again. Confirmation. Account closed at his request that morning. I called the landlord. Lease terminated early under a clause I barely remembered signing. My phone buzzed once more. Automated notification. Missed business payment due under my name. That was when the truth finally settled in my chest. Heavy and undeniable. This wasn't a collapse. It was an exit. And he believed he had timed it perfectly. I packed what little he had left behind into 2 suitcases and drove north before the sun came up. Savannah disappeared in my rearview mirror in shades of gray and pink. And I kept telling myself this was temporary. I would go home to Augusta. Regroup. Figure things out. I still hadn't told my mother the full story. I said only that Travis and I were having problems. The word problems felt almost laughable against the weight of divorce papers and debt. When I pulled into my mother's driveway, she was already standing at the door. She studied my face for less than a second before pulling me into her arms. "What did he do?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer. Not yet. I carried my suitcases into my childhood bedroom. The floral wallpaper unchanged. My high school trophies still lined up like relics from a simpler life. I set the divorce folder on the desk and turned my phone back on. That was when I saw the notification. I had been tagged in a post. Travis's sister had written something vague but pointed. Some people don't understand sacrifice. Praying for strength during hard transitions. Beneath it, comments poured in. Sympathy for him. Praise for his ambition. Subtle suggestions that not everyone was cut out for the pressures of building a company. One comment caught my breath. He carried that marriage financially for so long. Carried. My name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. In a small southern community, everyone reads between the lines. I stared at the wording. It didn't sound emotional. It sounded careful. Almost legal. As if someone had reviewed it before it went live. By that evening, 2 old acquaintances had messaged me, asking gently what had happened. I typed responses and deleted them. I didn't trust myself to speak without shaking. A few weeks later, Thanksgiving approached. I was still in my mother's house, still sorting through documents, still pretending this was a temporary detour. That was when Travis's mother called. "We think it would be good if you came to dinner," she said, "to clear the air." Every instinct told me not to go, but a small part of me still believed in civility, in resolution, in the idea that adults could sit around a table and speak honestly. So I went. The house smelled like roasted turkey and sweet potatoes. His father shook my hand like I was a colleague. Not his former daughter-in-law. Travis wasn't there. He was traveling for business. We sat at the long dining table. His sister smiled politely and passed the rolls. "We know this has been difficult," his mother began, folding her napkin precisely. "Building a company requires a certain resilience." I kept my voice steady. I supported that company. "Of course," she replied quickly. "But pressure reveals strengths and weaknesses." His father cleared his throat. Travis had to make strategic decisions. Investors don't respond well to instability. Instability. His sister glanced at me. Shared debt responsibility can be overwhelming if you're not used to managing it. They knew. They knew the numbers before I had even fully processed them. At one point, I excused myself to the hallway bathroom just to breathe. As I passed the study, I heard his father's voice through the half-closed door. He secured the investors before cutting losses. He said in a low tone, "It was the only way." Cutting losses. I drove home from that dinner with my hands clenched around the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. The next morning, a certified letter arrived. Official notice. I was listed as co-signer on a business credit line tied to Travis's startup. The amount was higher than I had understood. Payment deadlines outlined in cold. Precise language. My pulse roared in my ears as I dialed his number. It went straight to voicemail. I called the company office. Another voicemail. By the afternoon, I was sitting in a small law office downtown. The walls lined with framed degrees and muted landscapes. The attorney, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, flipped through my documents carefully. You're legally liable under joint signature, he said. Bankruptcy might be your cleanest option. Bankruptcy. The word felt like a brand on my forehead. Is there any way to contest this? I asked. He adjusted his glasses. Possibly. If there was misrepresentation, we'd need evidence. Evidence. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed again. Credit alert. A missed business payment had already begun affecting my score. That evening, my mother sat across from me at the kitchen table. I can refinance the house, she said quietly. We'll figure this out. No, I replied immediately. I won't pass this to you. For the first time since the empty townhouse, something inside me shifted. The humiliation was still there, but it wasn't paralyzing anymore. It was clarifying. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a narrative. One where I was the unstable wife, the financial liability, the emotional weakness. I went upstairs and spread every document I had across my childhood desk. Loan agreements, incorporation filings, amendments one barely remembered signing. They thought I would fold under the weight of debt and shame. They didn't realize I had started reading every line they assumed I would ignore. 5 years later, I was 27 and living in a converted garage behind a brick ranch house on the edge of Augusta. The space smelled faintly of motor oil, no matter how much lavender spray I used. My bed sat against one wall, a narrow desk against the other, and a small kitchenette wedged in between. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every bill taped to the inside of the cabinet had been paid by me. Every dollar accounted for. I worked mornings as an administrative assistant at a local logistics company, and evenings doing bookkeeping for a family-owned diner off Broad Street. Numbers no longer intimidated me. They steadied me. They made sense in ways people never had. One Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed with a credit alert. Score increase? It wasn't dramatic. Just a small climb, but I stared at it longer than I probably should have. For the first time in years, I wasn't sinking. I was inching upward. At night, after my second shift, I attended business law classes at the community college. I wasn't chasing prestige. I was chasing language. Terms like fiduciary duty, misrepresentation, liability exposure. Words that once would have blurred together now stood out like warning signs. I began rereading every document from my marriage. I organized them into labeled folders. Incorporation papers, loan agreements, amended filings. I noticed things I had missed before. Dates, margins, small notations in the corner of pages. One evening, while cross-referencing documents for an assignment on contract disclosures, I froze. An amendment to the operating agreement had been filed weeks before Travis told me the company was struggling. The timestamp preceded our separation by nearly a month. I didn't remember attending any meeting about it. My signature was there. Dated. Clean. I stared at it until my vision blurred. Had I signed that the night he said he needed routine paperwork handled quickly? Had I been too tired to read? A few days later, my phone rang while I was on my lunch break, sitting alone in my car with a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Naomi. The voice was cautious. This is Martin Hale. It took me a moment to place him. Then I remembered. Travis's former accountant. I'm no longer with the company, he said quietly. But I've been following the civil filing. My pulse quickened. Why are you calling me? He paused. Because you should understand how the debt structure was created. The air inside my car felt thin. He explained that projected revenue numbers had been aggressively optimistic during the period I was listed as co-owner. He mentioned categories of liability that had shifted just before investor negotiations intensified. Were you present at the restructuring meetings? He asked. No, I said. I wasn't told there were meetings. Silence lingered on the line. There are documents, he said carefully, that you may not have been shown. After we hung up, I sat motionless. The engine off. The Georgia heat pressing against the windshield. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was confirmation that my instincts weren't paranoia. That evening, I emailed my attorney and requested another appointment. We met 2 days later in the same modest office where he had once recommended bankruptcy. I placed the documents on his desk in chronological order. I explained the amendment discrepancy. I told him about Martin's call. He leaned back slowly. "If these disclosures were incomplete at the time you signed," he said, "there may be grounds for misrepresentation." The word felt powerful. Precise. We filed a request for formal document discovery. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no public statements, just paperwork submitted quietly into the system. Meanwhile, my life remained small and disciplined. I avoided dating. I avoided gossip. On weekends, I cleaned the diner's books while the owner's grandchildren ran between tables. My mother stopped offering to refinance her house. She could see something had changed in me. Humiliation had hardened into focus. One night, as I reviewed a stack of filings, I noticed another inconsistency. My signature date and the filing timestamp didn't align cleanly. The document appeared to have been processed hours before I would have had physical access to it. I highlighted the discrepancy in yellow. Weeks later, a certified letter arrived confirming preliminary acceptance of my civil claim for expanded review. It wasn't a victory. It was a door cracking open. I sealed a new folder and labeled it with the company's name in careful block letters. For the first time since that empty townhouse, I didn't feel like I was reacting. He had believed he could end my future in one calculated move. What he didn't understand was that I had begun learning the language of consequences. I was 28 when I saw the engagement photos. I was sitting at my small kitchen table in Augusta, highlighter in hand, reviewing a stack of amended filings when my phone vibrated. I almost ignored it. Notifications no longer controlled me. But the name on the screen caught my eye. Travis Monroe is engaged. The photo opened to a bright waterfront backdrop in Charleston. He stood in a tailored navy suit, one hand resting confidently at his side, the other holding the waist of a woman I recognized from business articles. Caroline Whitmore, daughter of a prominent regional investor whose firm had recently increased its stake in Travis's company. The caption read, "Excited for this new chapter. Grateful for resilience, growth, and unwavering support." Resilience. I stared at the word. There was no mention of co-founders, no mention of restructuring, no mention of a marriage that ended in foreclosure and debt. Just a carefully polished narrative of a self-made founder who overcame early setbacks. The comments flooded in. Congratulations. Applause. Mentions of strategic alignment between two powerful families. I zoomed into the background of one image. Behind them, printed subtly along the event banner, was the logo of Whitmore Holdings, the same holding company now referenced in my pending document review. My jaw tightened. The narrative wasn't just romantic. It was corporate. A few days later, my attorney called. "They've requested an extension on discovery," he said. "New counsel involved?" "Whitmore?" I asked. "Yes, of course." The engagement wasn't just personal. It was consolidation, public image strengthening, investor confidence signaling stability. For the first time in years, doubt crept in. What if he outran consequence? What if the audit stalled quietly and I was left holding nothing but legal bills and old resentment? That evening, as I sat alone at my desk, my phone rang. "Travis." I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. I answered. "Naomi," he said, voice calm. Controlled. "I thought we should talk." "I don't see why." He exhaled softly. "The engagement has created some complications. Continuing this legal action could escalate things unnecessarily." "Unnecessarily," I repeated. "You've made your point," he said. "There were misunderstandings. But this is bigger now. There are investors, families involved." "Families. You mean her family?" I said. A brief silence. "We're prepared to offer a settlement," he continued smoothly. "A reasonable one. You can close this chapter cleanly." Cleanly for who? For everyone. I could almost hear the calculation in his pause. "I've reviewed the documents," I said evenly. "The timeline doesn't align." He laughed lightly. as if indulging a child. You're reading too much into paperwork. Investors conducted due diligence. They found nothing concerning. Nothing concerning. The phrase echoed long after the call ended. 2 days later, Martin emailed me again. A short message. He had reviewed public filings connected to the engagement announcement. Ownership percentages shifted just before the announcement. He wrote, "Might want to compare dates." I forwarded it to my attorney immediately. We met in person that week. Spread across his desk were copies of restructuring documents, intellectual property transfers, and amended shareholder agreements. They moved assets strategically, he said, possibly to insulate exposure. Before the engagement, I added. He nodded. And before your claim was expanded. My heartbeat steadied. This wasn't panic anymore. It was positioning. Later that month, a formal court date was scheduled. No more extensions. The invitation to the engagement party arrived in the mail 2 days after that. Cream-colored cardstock. Elegant script. A Charleston address overlooking the harbor. I held it for a long moment before placing it inside the folder labeled with his company's name. At 22, I would have reacted. Posted something emotional. Defended myself publicly. Tried to reclaim dignity in front of strangers. At 28, I chose silence. Not because I was defeated. Because timing mattered. He believed a ring on another woman's hand would erase what had happened between us. He believed a polished narrative would outweigh documentation. But the court date was circled in red on my calendar. And for the first time since I walked into that empty townhouse, I didn't feel small watching him celebrate. I felt patient. The morning of the hearing, the air outside the Savannah courthouse felt thick enough to press against my lungs. I stood at the base of the wide stone steps, a leather folder tucked under my arm, watching people filter through the heavy glass doors. A local reporter lingered nearby. Not for me, but for the Whitmore name now attached to the case. Investor families drew attention. Travis arrived 10 minutes later. Tailored gray suit. Polished shoes. His posture still confident, but tighter than I remembered. Beside him walked his attorney, and a man I recognized from business articles, Caroline's father. He didn't look at me at first. At 22, I had walked into an empty townhouse and felt erased. At 28, I walked into a courtroom with documentation. Inside, the proceedings moved with procedural calm. The judge reviewed the civil claim. Financial misrepresentation during marital liability disclosure tied to corporate restructuring. Travis's attorney spoke first. This is an emotionally driven dispute stemming from a failed marriage, he said smoothly. My client acted in good faith to preserve a struggling company. Emotionally driven. I kept my hands folded in my lap. My attorney stood next. He laid out the timeline. Amendment filings dated weeks before I was informed. Liability categories shifted without full disclosure. Signature inconsistencies. Martin testified remotely, his voice steady as he described revenue projections and internal restructuring discussions. Was Mrs. Monroe present at those meetings? My attorney asked. No. Martin replied. Not to my knowledge. A faint ripple moved through the courtroom. Then came the document. The amended incorporation filing appeared on the screen, time-stamped before I had even been told the company was in crisis. The judge leaned forward slightly. Mr. Monroe, she said, were all material changes disclosed to your spouse at the time of execution? Travis cleared his throat. Yes, he said. To the best of my understanding. To the best of your understanding, the judge repeated. My attorney introduced an internal memo obtained during discovery. A reference to legacy liabilities being isolated prior to investor negotiations. In the gallery? Mr. Whitmore shifted in his seat. The air changed. For a brief second, Travis's composure cracked. Not dramatically. Just a flicker. After a short recess, the judge returned with her preliminary ruling. She did not grant full financial restitution. Not yet. But she acknowledged credible evidence of incomplete disclosure and ordered expanded review. including examination of related filings submitted to state regulatory bodies. My debt liability was temporarily paused pending audit outcome. It wasn't victory. It was leverage. Outside the courtroom, a reporter approached Travis first. Mr. Monroe, are there broader regulatory implications for your company? His attorney stepped in quickly, offering a rehearsed statement about transparency and cooperation. I slipped past without speaking. In the hallway near the exit, Travis caught up to me. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," he said under his breath. "I didn't start it," I replied. "You're dragging investors into something personal." I met his eyes evenly. "The paperwork did that." His jaw tightened. "You're going to damage the company." "You already did," I said quietly. For a moment, the old dynamic tried to surface, the subtle intimidation, the suggestion that I was out of my depth. But it no longer worked. "I offered you a clean settlement," he said. "Clean for you?" I answered. He hesitated, then added, "There are internal reviews happening already. This could get messy." Messy. The word echoed differently now. I walked past him and out into the sunlight. My attorney joined me at the base of the steps. "The regulatory inquiry could expand," he said. "If discrepancies are confirmed, this won't stay confined to your civil claim." I nodded. As I drove back toward Augusta, the city skyline shrinking behind me, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Not triumph, not revenge. Stability. He once believed he could transfer assets, shift liability, and erase my name from the foundation of his company without consequence. That morning, the foundation itself began to move. And for the first time since he smiled in that empty kitchen, he didn't look certain anymore. The regulatory review moved faster than anyone expected. Within weeks of the hearing, state examiners began requesting supplemental documentation from Travis's company. Media coverage stayed restrained. But the words "compliance inquiry" appeared in more than one business column. Whitmore Holdings released a brief statement about its commitment to transparency. My debt liability remained suspended pending audit findings. For the first time in years, I could breathe without calculating which bill would be late. Then my attorney called. "There's a litigation strategist out of Charleston advising the investor side now," he said. "Name's Harrison Cole." "Opposing counsel?" I asked. "Not exactly. Regulatory risk consultant. He'll be reviewing exposure across all filings." A week later, I found myself driving east toward Charleston for a joint compliance meeting. The office overlooked the harbor, sunlight reflecting off the water in sharp lines. I sat across from a man in his mid-30s. Dark suit, sleeves rolled neatly at the wrist. No flashy watch. No performative confidence. "Ms. Monroe," he said, extending his hand. Harrison Cole. His handshake was firm, not dominating. We began reviewing documents immediately. No small talk. "You flagged the amendment timing discrepancy?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded once. "Good catch." No skepticism. No condescension. Just acknowledgement. As the meeting progressed, he asked pointed questions about disclosure procedures, communication logs, and board meeting minutes. He challenged assumptions from both sides, including my own. "You're certain you weren't present during the restructuring discussion?" he pressed. "I'm certain," I replied. He studied the document in front of him. "Then this creates exposure beyond the marital dispute." Exposure. The word carried weight when he said it. After the session, as attorneys gathered their files, Harrison lingered. "Off the record," he said quietly. "Federal oversight tends to follow patterns like this." "Federal?" I asked. He gave a small nod. "If state findings indicate systemic non-disclosure, it doesn't stop there." The idea should have frightened me. Instead, it steadied me. Over the next few months, I was invited to assist in additional compliance reviews. My familiarity with the original filings made me useful. I began consulting independently to offset my legal costs, reviewing small business contracts for women in Augusta who were launching their own ventures. Harrison requested copies of the financial reconstruction logs I had built for myself. "You tracked every payment?" he asked one afternoon. "Every one." He studied the spreadsheet carefully. "Most people don't document like this. Most people don't get erased like that." I replied before I could stop myself. He didn't smile. He didn't soften his tone. He just nodded. "I respect that," he said. The investor family quietly postponed the engagement celebration. No official announcement. Just silence where celebration had been scheduled. Internal audit reports surfaced. And Travis stopped giving interviews. One evening, Harrison called. "There's something you should know," he said. Internal review uncovered discrepancies not previously disclosed in court. "They're expanding the scope." My pulse quickened. But not from panic. "And Travis?" I asked. "He attempted to secure bridge financing last week," Harrison replied. "It was denied." Denied. For the first time since this began, I stopped checking Travis's social media entirely. My attention shifted elsewhere. Harrison invited me to collaborate on drafting a compliance risk framework for emerging startups. The proposal focused on governance, transparency, and joint accountability, concepts that once would have sounded abstract to me. We worked late in conference rooms overlooking the harbor. Documents spread between us. Our conversations were direct, sometimes challenging. "Why didn't you declare bankruptcy?" he asked one night as we packed up. "Because it would have confirmed their version of me," I said. "Irresponsible. Weak." He considered that. "You chose the harder path." I chose the one that kept my name intact. Weeks later, after a long strategy session, he paused near the elevator. "There's a place on King Street that stays open late," he said. "We could continue this conversation there." The invitation hung between us. At 22, I would have confused proximity with protection. At 30, I understood boundaries. "This stays professional," I said carefully. "Of course," he replied without hesitation. Dinner was simple. Conversation deliberate. He spoke about a restructuring case that had nearly cost him his firm years earlier. I spoke about the foreclosure notice I still kept folded in a drawer. No pity. No grand declarations. Just two people who understood consequences. As we walked along the harbor afterward, the city lights reflecting on the water, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about structure. He once believed I would never rise again. What he didn't understand was that I was no longer standing alone, and this time, I had chosen my ally carefully. By the time I was 34, the headlines had changed. What began as a state compliance review had expanded into a formal federal inquiry. Words like disclosure failure and regulatory violation appeared beside Travis's company name in business journals that once praised his ambition. Whitmore Holdings released a statement distancing itself from day-to-day operations. The engagement was officially postponed indefinitely. Then it was quietly dissolved. The board announced executive restructuring. Travis stepped down to focus on personal matters. I read the press release at my desk in Charleston. Sunlight cutting across stacks of documents bearing my name beneath the title Senior Risk Analyst. Karma didn't look like lightning striking a building. It looked like footnotes in public filings. Harrison's firm had been retained to oversee transitional risk containment and asset restructuring. When the email confirming our selection came through, I read it twice. We were not there to punish. We were there to stabilize. My name appeared on official correspondence sent to former executives, including Travis. A week later, my assistant informed me that Travis had requested a private consultation before the full restructuring meeting. I agreed. We met in a neutral office space overlooking the harbor, the same city where his engagement photos had once flooded my screen. He entered alone. He looked older, thinner. The easy certainty I once knew had been replaced by something tighter, more measured. "Naomi," he said, as if testing the sound of my name. "Travis." We sat across from one another at a polished conference table. No wedding rings. No shared bank accounts. Just paper. "I appreciate you taking the time," he began. This situation has been complicated. Regulatory findings tend to be, I replied. He cleared his throat. I'm working toward a resolution with the board. There are settlement discussions underway. I waited. There's a possibility, he continued carefully, that a character statement from you could help contextualize some of the early-stage decisions. A character statement. You're asking me to testify to your good faith, I asked. He leaned back slightly. The pressure we were under. The startup environment. Investors. I remembered Thanksgiving dinner. His father calling me instability. His sister implying I couldn't handle shared debt responsibility. I know what I was told, I said evenly. He exhaled. This doesn't have to stay adversarial. We were young. Mistakes were made. You transferred liability without disclosure, I said calmly. That wasn't youth. That was strategy. His jaw tightened. But he didn't deny it. There are investor negotiations happening now, he added. Your perspective could influence how this lands in. Influence. I'm not the one influencing it, I replied. The filings are. He hesitated, then glanced toward the folder in front of me. I've heard Harrison's firm is deeply involved, he said. Why is that? Because we were selected for our expertise. Because we understood governance. Because I married him last spring in a small ceremony overlooking the water, with no press release and no strategic alignment. Harrison is my husband, I said quietly. Silence settled across the table. He stared at me, genuinely stunned for the first time in years. You remarried, he said slowly. Yes? When? Last spring. He leaned back. Processing. You always moved on quickly, he muttered. Almost reflexively. I felt no need to defend myself. I didn't move on quickly, I said. I rebuilt carefully. He shifted in his seat. So this firm is operating within its professional mandate, I finished. As am I. I slid a document across the table. Preliminary compliance acknowledgement outlining executive disclosure failures and restructuring terms. You'll need to review and sign, I said. He scanned the pages, his expression tightening as he read clauses limiting his future authority and outlining asset liquidation parameters. This leaves me with very little leverage, he said. That depends on how you define leverage. He looked up sharply. For a moment, I saw the ghost of the man who once stood in an empty kitchen and told me I wasn't built for real life. Now he was asking me to soften consequences. I'm not here for revenge, I said quietly. I'm here for compliance. He held my gaze, searching for anger. There wasn't any. After a long pause, he picked up the pen and signed the acknowledgement. The sound of ink against paper was soft. Final. He stood, gathering his jacket. I never thought, he began, then stopped. Neither did I said. He left the room without another word. Through the glass wall, I could see Harrison waiting in the adjacent conference space, reviewing a separate file. At 22, I had signed documents without reading them. At 34, I reviewed the ones that determined who would, and this time, I understood every line. The letter releasing me from all remaining liability arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. It was thinner than I expected. No dramatic language. No apology. Just a formal confirmation that the restructuring process was complete and that I was no longer tied, legally or financially, to the company that had once nearly buried me. I sat at my desk overlooking the Charleston harbor and read it twice anyway. At 22, I had walked into an empty townhouse and believed my future had collapsed in a single afternoon. At 35, I held a document proving it hadn't. Travis relocated out of state within months of the restructuring. There was no public statement announcing his departure. No scandalous headline about exile. His name simply stopped appearing in business articles. The silence that followed was louder than any downfall could have been. I thought I would feel vindicated. Instead, I felt finished. Harrison found me staring out the window that evening. It's done, I said. He nodded once, not asking for more. He understood that closure doesn't always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it arrives like paperwork, quiet, official, undeniable. Our marriage was not built on rescue. We kept separate accounts with shared visibility. We reviewed contracts together. We asked questions before signing anything, even small service agreements. Transparency wasn't romantic. It was steady. The first time we signed our joint mortgage documents, I read every clause out loud. He didn't laugh. He listened. There were moments when I thought back to the girl who believed love meant protection. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her that protection doesn't come from someone holding all the passwords. It comes from knowing how to read the agreement. My role at the firm expanded over the next year. I began leading workshops for women launching startups with their spouses. We talked about operating agreements, voting rights, debt allocation. I told them that asking questions isn't distrust. It's diligence. During one session, a woman in her late 50s raised her hand. "I supported my husband's business for 20 years, she said. "And when it failed, I was the one creditors called. I wish someone had told me what you're saying now." I recognized the tightness in her voice, the mix of embarrassment and anger. "I wish someone had told me too," I replied. After the workshop, I went back to my office and opened a small drawer. Inside it, folded carefully, was the foreclosure notice from the townhouse in Savannah. I kept it not because I needed to relive the pain, but because I needed to remember the distance. He had believed financial collapse would define me. He had believed reputation damage would silence me. He had believed marriage was leverage. What he never understood was that being underestimated gave me room to grow. Betrayal forced me to learn language I once ignored. Debt taught me discipline. Humiliation sharpened my focus. Revenge, when it finally arrived, didn't look like shouting in a courtroom or exposing secrets online. It looked like competence. It looked like sitting across from the man who once dismissed me and feeling nothing but clarity. Some evenings, Harrison and I walk along the harbor after work. The air smells like salt and sun-warmed wood. Boats drift in and out with quiet certainty. "Do you ever regret any of it?" he asked me once. "No," I said honestly, because if he hadn't smiled that afternoon in the empty kitchen, I might never have learned to stand in rooms like the ones I stand in now. At 22, I thought being left broke meant I had failed. At 35, I understand it meant I had been redirected. If you're listening to this and you've ever been left with nothing, financially, emotionally, socially, I want you to know this. Being counted out is not the end of your story. Sometimes it's the first honest chapter. Have you ever had to rebuild after betrayal or divorce? What lesson cost you the most, and what did it teach you? I'd truly love to read your story in the comments. And if stories about dignity, justice, and rebuilding your life speak to you, stay here with me. There are more women who were underestimated, more quiet reversals, more moments where the tables turned without anyone needing to shout. Subscribe if you believe growth is the most powerful form of revenge, because sometimes the person who walks away smiling is the one who never sees what you become.